We're here on the Janiculum hill, across the Tiber from the center of Rome. This hill is an important spot, and we're here to talk about memory in the city. We're here to talk about how memory is concretized, made permanent by architecture. Now, when we were on the Campidoglio, we talked about the mythical prehistory of the city of Rome, when the god Janus and the god Saturn had founded cities on opposite banks of the Tiber. Saturn had founded his city on the Capitoline Hill. Remember, Saturn is actually the father of all the gods of Olympus. The Etruscan god Janus founded his city on this Etruscan side of the Tiber, the Tuscan side of the Tiber River. Now, the Etruscans are very interesting people. In many ways predated the Romans and had a powerful empire long before the Romans did. The Etruscans owned an area called Etruria that was a collection of really individual cities. And Etruria more or less corresponds to our modern-day Tuscany, and from which we get the word Tuscany. Janus was one of their principal gods. He was eventually, like the Etruscan Empire, absorbed into the Roman panoply and the Roman Empire. Janus was a two-faced god. Janus had a face facing both forward and back. He was a god of boundaries. He was a god of beginnings. So you find images of Janus at bridges, points of transition, at gateways. He's also the god that gave us the name of our first month of the year, January. And in Ovid, the Roman poet's poem on the seasons and feasts of the year, at the beginning when Janus introduces himself, he says, "I am Janus, and the ancients called me Chaos because I'm a primitive matter." So he's a god who's venerable, goes back to the earliest mythological times, and represents something very essential and fundamental about the Etruscan worldview. Again, like I said, he was eventually absorbed, like all of Etruria, into the Roman Empire. But it's not in a way accidental that we're here, because we're interested in this idea of memory and how memory is concretized. And memory, in order to be made permanent, involves both looking back and looking forward, thinking about the past, what is to be remembered, and creating some way of remembering it into the future. And architecture was one of the primary ways that was achieved. Now, because we're on the Tuscan side of the Tiber, on the Etruscan side of the Tiber, we're going to see that that actually has had some influence on the kind of architecture that we're looking at, the specific use of the classical language. Now, Janus being a god of beginnings and boundaries, he's also associated with a kind of partly a mystical dimension of the Etruscans. He's also sometimes, it was true around the time that this temple was built, he was also thought to be perhaps either a descendant of or Noah himself, that Noah's ark had somehow landed here in Etruria. Janus, having been essentially associated with the Roman Empire, is somebody who has then begins to be absorbed into Christian culture as a symbolic or allegorical figure, somebody who represents that idea of looking both forward and back. And his symbol is in fact the symbol of the American Academy in Rome, just up the hill from here, because the Academy is about studying the past and working towards the future. The Tempietto means little temple, and it marks a very specific spot. There was an idea that emerged at some point in the Middle Ages that St. Peter had been crucified on this spot. The reason they believed that was because it was said that Peter had been crucified inter dues metas, between two metas. And in fact, in the Middle Ages, they didn't really know what the Romans meant by a meta. Now, for the Romans, a meta was something between an obelisk and a pyramid, if you like, a kind of either squat obelisk or a very tall pyramid. And it was found in the middle, or the meta, of a circus, a Roman circus. It eventually formed part of the spine around which the track ran. And it, in fact, is true that Peter was probably crucified in the Circus of Nero next to St. Peter's, inter dues metas. But in the Middle Ages, a story had grown up that those two metas were in fact two pyramids that still existed in Rome at that time that had survived from the Roman Empire. One on the south side of town was believed to be the tomb of Remus, and the one on essentially the northwest side of town, near St. Peter's, near the Castel San Angelo, was believed to be the tomb of Romulus. And these pyramids, being thought of as metas, meant that somebody thought, therefore, that between two metas meant this spot on the Janiculum Hill. Now, in order to calculate that, they needed some kind of map to be able to do that, some sense in which Rome was more than just a mystical destination, but a place that actually had a topography and a cartography and could be measured and understood. And so somebody actually had to calculate the distance between these two pyramids and locate this spot. The pyramid they thought of as the Pyramid of Remus on the south side of town still survives. It was incorporated into the Aurelianic walls in the 3rd century, and it actually has the name of the person who had built it for himself as his private tomb, a person named Cestius. The one near the Vatican did not survive. In fact, it was demolished right around the time that this temple was being built, almost paradoxically. Now, because that one near the Vatican and near Castel Sant'Angelo was thought to be the tomb of Romulus, the actual founder of Rome, it was symbolically important because Peter was often thought of as like a new Romulus, a new founder of Rome, because he had baptized Rome in his blood as one of the martyrs who brought Christianity to Rome. So this spot has associations with the very ancient world, even before the Romans, and then it gets this new association through St. Peter with the church and the beginning of Christianity here in Rome, and the presence of the papacy, naturally. So what we're going to be talking about as we talk about the architecture is how that idea about this particular place, what's embedded in the place, in the site itself, and the idea of Peter's crucifixion is concretized in the architecture. Now, the place where Peter was crucified was believed to be a slight declivity in the ground, a little hole in the ground that corresponds to the site of this temple behind me. The church here, San Pietro Montorio, built just before the Tempietta was built, obviously dedicated to St. Peter, was meant to memorialize that site, but wasn't built immediately on top of it, as St. Peter's was built on top of the tomb of Peter. Instead, it was built adjacent to it, probably imagining that something like this Tempietta would be built soon afterwards. When San Pietro Montorio was dedicated, in the altar were encased a number of relics, some associated with the Passion of Christ, and some with the death of Peter, including wood from Peter's cross. When that church was built, it was built roughly from 1488 until the year 1500, which was a Jubilee year. And just before that Jubilee year, Donato Bramante, an architect from the north of Italy, arrived in town to study the ancient remains. And he's the architect of this temple, and we'll talk more about Donato Bramante in just a minute. So when Bramante's commissioned to do this temple, he's meant to concretize this spot. The part that we see is the part that emerges above ground. But there's also a grotto or crypt down below that's actually located over the site where the cross was believed to be embedded. The reason the church is called San Pietro Montorio is Montorio derives from the Latin Mons Aureus, or the golden mountain, golden hill, because the earth of this hill is quite yellow and sandy and has a kind of golden color. And so this is the golden hill. And in fact, the earth down below this site was actually exposed in the crypt to recall that name. So we're on a very specific site, loaded with lots of meanings, lots of stories, lots of associations. And the architect here is trying to embody those, encase them in some way, make them memorable, and carry them from the past into the future. How he does that with architecture is fascinating, and that's what we'll be talking about next.